Good afternoon. I am François Carrel-Billiard, Associate Director of the European Institute at Columbia. And on behalf of the events organizers, the Columbia Global Center in Paris, the Alliance Program, and the European Institute, I'm delighted to welcome you to this debate, Are Europe and America Drifting Apart? This event is part of our new series, Debating the Future of Europe. We have a wonderful team of panelists with us today, Célia Belin, Sheri Berman, Jack Snyder, Pierre Vimont, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Roger Cohen. Roger has worked for the New York Times for 30 years as a foreign correspondent, a foreign editor, and a columnist. For the readers of the time, it's been a very illuminating experience to see the world through Roger's eyes throughout those years. And we invite you to read Roger's last column published by the Times this weekend. This is an au revoir, but not an adieu. And this is not an adieu because Roger is now becoming the head of the Times Bureau in Paris. We are impatient to read his reporting from France. And we would like to thank him and also our panelists for being with us to discuss this topic about Europe and America today. We hope this discussion comes at the right moment. Roger, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francois. Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm in limbo between two jobs on my way next month to Paris. I'm delighted to be joined today by four very distinguished panelists. Célia Belin, who is visiting fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe at Brookings. Sheri Berman, who is professor of political science at Barnard College, Columbia University, and the author of several books. Jack Snyder, who is the Robert and René Belfer Professor of International Relations at Columbia University, and Pierre Vimont, who is a senior fellow at Carnegie Europe, former French ambassador to the United States, and an ambassadeur de France. We have a very interesting subject today on whether and to what extent Europe and the United States are drifting apart. We've clearly come through a difficult, not to say traumatic season, 4-year season under President Trump. And we don't know yet what the new administration of Joe Biden will do. I would like to start by asking Célia this. Célia, what do you think the toll of President Trump's anti-EU, anti-NATO, and generally dismissive approach to Europe has been? How serious, even devastating, has the impact of all this been on transatlantic relations?
Roger, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I'm discovering this question on the consequences of Donald Trump's rhetoric that was both anti-EU and anti-NATO, but it's a question that has been on everybody's mind for the past 4 years on whether this would have an impact not only in the US, in maybe the American engagement towards the EU and towards NATO, within the Republican camp and at large within the entire American society, and a question, of course, on what is the consequence back in Europe on this rhetoric. Can it actually affect the way we perceive the European Union and NATO? And I think the answer to that are two different answers entirely. The second one, on which I won't spend time, would be that Europeans reacted very strongly and had to ask for themselves the very strong questions of what do I want NATO to look like and what do I want the EU to look like? And I believe that Europeans have found a much better answer on the European Union question, where they have they have gotten more united and they have worked together to integrate more. And on NATO, as Emmanuel Macron said, famously said, he said NATO is brain dead because there's nobody in control at the moment, and that's the lack of, or let's say Trump's anti-NATO rhetoric really affected the direction and the leadership within NATO. But more generally, there's a question on, does it have an effect in the US, and will it have a lingering effect beyond the administration of Donald Trump? And there you have to go back, I believe, to this very strong polarization we are living through in the US, where at the same time, I see and hear advisors and Democrats talking about strengthening the US-EU relationship post-Trump because the EU was considered a foe by Donald Trump, in the sort of vice versa effect. Americans, Democrats are really strongly becoming pro-EU. But on the larger scale, I think there was a sort of a transformation, a fundamental transformation of the approach by the fact that Donald Trump asked the hard question and allowed it for these hard questions to be asked. And so now there's no, stone that would be unturned. We can ask hard questions on everything, including on NATO. And I believe in the next few years, there will be a lot of questions on where do we take this alliance from there. There's no return to the past. We have to move forward and find a new sense of direction. And so I think that's the main effect we saw, a sort of upsurge of pro-EU rhetoric, but at the same time, deep questioning on where this alliance is going.
Thank you very much. Jack, picking up on those last words from Célia, that there's no going back to where we were before, to what extent do you think that the Trump policies are reversible, and one could go to some status quo ante? And to what degree do you think it's even desirable to try to reverse some of these policies? I mean, Joe Biden is clearly a long-standing Europeanist. I've seen him at the Munich Security Conference ever since I can remember. He has, even probably more than Barack Obama, a natural affinity for the transatlantic relationship. But to what degree is all this reversible? And should we try to reverse it? Yeah.
Many of the policies are, I think, quickly reversible. Biden has already put out his list of things that he wants to do. Some of the policies, maintaining US military strength in Europe, are not wildly different from what the actual policy of Trump's state was, no matter what Trump himself happened to tweet or say at any given moment. I think there's a question about what aspects of Biden's policies he'll be able to enact, ones that would require spending money, like climate change and green energy. Massive investments would require congressional authorization, which is at the moment hanging in the balance. But I think the most important question is in the mind of Europeans who've seen this oscillation in American foreign policy, where it's gone from Bush, the Lone Ranger, who didn't need a permission slip from Europe, to Obama, who got awarded the Peace Prize before he had actually done anything, to Trump, who was the worst nightmare, and now back to Biden, who seems warm and cozy, like old times. How can the Europeans trust an alliance that has this kind of bizarre on and off switch?
Thank you. Pierre, I will now turn to you, if I may. Sorry about that. President Macron, faced by Trump's attitudes toward Europe, dismissive attitudes, he initially tried to reach out to the president. That didn't really come to much fruition. But more recently, he has spoken of the need for Europe to have, quote, strategic autonomy. And that, of course, echoes to some degree Angela Merkel speaking of the need for Europe to take our fate into our own hands, quote unquote. What, Pierre, do you understand by this notion of strategic autonomy for Europe?
I think Macron very recently, in an interview that he made a few days ago, came back to this notion of strategic autonomy and said that it was the ability for Europeans, I'm not quoting exactly, but it was the ability for Europeans to decide about their future and to decide about the rules they want to apply. Which means we work in good complementarity with America, among other things in NATO, but we want to be able, where we need to act on our own and to decide on our own how we want to do this. The real issue about this strategic autonomy is whether all Europeans see eye to eye on this. And of course, there could be at least many different shades of strategic autonomy. For Emmanuel Macron, strategic autonomy should cover all types of challenges that the European Union is facing, from security to climate change, to new tech, to our policy in the Middle East or in North Africa. So it's a lot. It's a lot, and many Europeans still think that with Joe Biden coming into the White House and on the 20th of January, to some extent, things could go back to more or less what they were before. Everybody understands that times have changed. It won't be Obama 2.0, but still, they very much hope that with a much more decent president who is eager to find again the nice way of working together in this transatlantic partnership, we could find some sort of balance between a strong transatlantic partnership and an attempt to increase our strategic autonomy. But this balancing act is going to be something difficult for the Europeans to get some sort of agreement between themselves.
Well, presumably Viktor Orban, for example, would by no means agree with strategic autonomy, or Kaczynski, for that matter, in Poland. I mean,
yeah, not only these two, but many of the Baltic states, and even in Germany. You've heard the German defense minister speaking a few days ago at Politico, saying that she didn't think much about this strategic autonomy. So there's still some work to be done between the Europeans.
Sheri, with President Trump, we've seen a pretty extraordinary and, in my view, very depressing and upsetting abandonment of, let's call them Western values by the United States, by which I mean support for liberty, rule of law, human rights, rules-based international order. We've had a president who seemed much more at home with an autocratic ruler like Mohammed bin Salman than with a German chancellor like Angela Merkel. And I think that's left Europe feeling pretty lonely at times, facing China and Russia and the various forms of creeping autocracy of the 21st century. What do you think needs to be done in this area? Do you see Europe now and the United States coming together strongly in defense of our liberal model?
So I think there's two components to, there's two components rather to answering your question. I mean, there's no doubt that Biden is much more of the kind of liberal democratic leader that the United States likes to think it's always had and that Europeans are much more comfortable with. So in the sense that Biden will share what you call certain kinds of values with at least most West European leaders, yes, there will be more consensus in that regard. But alliances are not just based on values, they're obviously based on interests. And here there are some real questions that I think predate Trump, although were aggravated by him. I mean, look, there are issues about where American interests really lie. There was an op-ed in the Washington Post either yesterday or the day before by the French and German foreign ministers saying, look, you know, now that Trump is gone, let's Europe and the United States get together on the basis of our shared values. And I think, you know, again, those shared values will be much more in the forefront with Biden than they were with Trump. But the piece also recognizes that the main challenge going forward is China, both as a competitor and as a country that we would still like, despite its increasing autocratic tendencies, to pull into a more rule-based system. If the Europeans can't contribute materially to achieving that, which would require, I don't know if it would be Macron's kind of, you know, strategic actor, but coming together in some kind of unified way that would enable them to play a more significant role on the world stage, I suspect that Biden, even with his overlapping interests with many European leaders, will not end up relying or devoting a huge amount of energy to the transatlantic relationship, or rather not as much perhaps as Europeans would want. So part of the answer to this question really depends on how much Europe can contribute or offer, to be sort of blunt and realistic about it, the United States as far as its other interests are concerned. I would also say that there is still an open question about the Republican Party. Look, Trump, it's clear, as everybody has said, you know, was both not interested in Europe and not interested in any of the liberal values that that relationship was ostensibly based on. But it's unclear how much he has actually transformed the Republican Party. It's unclear, that is, if after Trump is gone, it will bounce back to being a more general supporter of a rule-based, open world order. If it does, then it will make Biden's job easier. It will make the Europeans' lives easier. But if he has transformed that party in ways that it is really remains in his shadow even after he is gone, given the way the American political system works, Biden will have even less freedom of maneuver with regards to, again, international arrangements, whether they be economic or security, than I think a lot of Europeans would like.
Thank you very much, Sheri. I think we should note that President Trump is not gone yet. We certainly hope and expect him to depart. He will clearly not do so graciously. I'd like to just pick up very quickly on the critical point you made about China. What would you see as the most constructive and effective joint European-US approach to China? The European Union has been tougher than I think we've seen in the past. The sanctions in relation to the clampdown in Hong Kong. Clearly, there are several human rights outrages in China, most prominently the persecution of more than 1 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. So, Sheri, what would you like to see Europe and the United States doing together in lockstep, maybe, with respect to policy toward China?
So that is an excellent question. I wish I had a great answer for it, because yes, then I would be a much more valuable outside commentator than I obviously am. But I would say two things, right? There's a fine balance that needs to be walked between standing up for, again, what you might call liberal democratic values, and unduly antagonizing a China that is clearly moved in the last years in an autocratic nationalist direction. So the fact that there has been no unified response to obvious outrages like the treatment of Uyghurs and the crushing of autonomy, democracy movements in Hong Kong is really just, I mean, it's shameful. As an American, you know, watching protesters in Hong Kong raise American flags and have them be ignored by the you know, our president and our government was just, I mean, really makes you want to cry, right? But on the other hand, one has to recognize this is a great power. It is a great power whose leader is currently using nationalism to kind of whip up the kind of support for his autocratic authoritarian moves, that creates a very dangerous situation. So on the one hand, I'd like to see Europe and the United States be much more unified in openly criticizing the Chinese regime for these obvious infractions of, you know, liberal democratic values. On the other hand, there have to be positive incentives as well. So there has to be more unified views on trade. There has to be more unified views on how to treat a whole variety of other kinds of economic issues that have come between not just the United States and China, but between China and other parts of the globe as well. So there has to be, I would say, some sticks, although I would be very careful using them in this current situation. But sticks without carrots when you're dealing with a great power like China is a recipe for getting nowhere. So cooperation on other kinds of things, economic issues, of course, strengthening NATO would help as well. I'm not sure how that's going to happen, given the fact that we have Turkey and other kinds of problems. But, you know, if the United States and Europe are stronger together, they can be both more effective in pushing and pulling China, I would say, in directions that would be useful, not just for the transatlantic alliance, but I would think for the globe overall.
Celia, okay, January 20, 2021, we all assume that Joe Biden takes office as the 46th president of the United States. Although I saw Richard Haas, the head of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, said yesterday that he expected there to be a counter inauguration of somebody we know only too well. So that was somewhat ominous. Anyway, there we are, you know, January 20 next year. You're in the Biden administration. You're concerned about the deterioration of relations with Europe. What would be the first gesture you would like to see to signal that a new era has dawned?
Well, I think the first gesture has been announced, even though it was probably not meant to be specifically about Europe. But Joe Biden has said that on day one of his new administration, he would rejoin the Paris Accord on climate. Yeah. And I think in itself, it's a powerful signal to Europeans and to the rest of the planet, obviously, but to European allies that this new administration will be cooperative on this massive global threat, and more generally that it intends to take its own share of responsibility. To follow up on what Sheri just said on China and other elements, I think one of the main tasks of this next administration will be first to recognize, as Jack pointed out, that there has been a lot of pendulum swing within American politics and American foreign policy, for which allies can be unsettled and for which we are unsure of what is the main direction. Recognizing these swings is also recognizing that the rule-based order has been weakened by those swings, and that there's a need now for this next administration to make the rule-based order more resilient, and more resilient not only to swings in American politics. So what if Donald Trump was to come back in 2024? What is some other
Please don't say that.
We just don't know what sort of wave of nationalism will be still persistent, people that might be uninterested by multilateral cooperation again. And the fact of the matter is the multilateral organization has been weakened not only by sort of the American retreat and the absence of America, but also by the fact that it let the door open for China to take on more role and to assert its own influence, and thereby, you know, skew it in a direction that might be not in the Euro-American interest, and more generally, that a lot of people worry is not in a universal interest. And so I think the first task, it's not only on climate, but it's on whole sorts of multilateralism areas. It's on trade, it's obviously dealing with the pandemic, is first and foremost to reinvest those multilateral organizations and make them more resilient, make them that so that they are able to live through those changes in politics, and so as to be able to have an area for global cooperation that does not depend on who is in the White House.
Thank you, Célia. Yeah, I don't think the word multilateral ever passed President Trump's lips any more than human rights. Jack, should the United States care about Europe? Isn't the post-1945 American-led transatlantic world order just dead? So 20th century at this point. Under Barack Obama, we already had the so-called pivot to Asia. Europe's pretty stable. Should the US care about Europe at all?
So I don't believe that the old formulas that bound the advanced capitalist liberal democracies together are obsolete at all. In fact, I tend to believe in the adage of back to the future. So speaking directly to the subject of our panel, I don't see the problem as so much America and Europe drifting apart as drifting apart internally of different factions and ways of life within the United States and within Europe. So in today's news, we're seeing Poland and Hungary in a showdown with the rest of the EU, blocking the financial aid package in order to avert pressure on them for drifting away from a liberal democracy. We've also seen Brexit. And we also see the struggle between mainstream and populist political forces within almost all of our countries. And so first point, I don't see the US and Europe drifting apart. I see lots of internal divisions that are problematic in and of themselves. And once there's a solution to them, there may be more solidarity between America and Europe. In terms of what is the formula for settling these divisions, I think that going back to the early 1950s formula, where you had liberal nation states that had, under the Bretton Woods system, a lot of national autonomy, but also coordination of national policy through liberal international organizations of a looser type than we see now with, say, the EU, is a better way to simultaneously satisfy the demands of democratic national self-determination and the craving of the citizens of nation states to have solutions to their problems that are more tailored for their own ways of life.
Thank you, Jack. Pierre, let me follow up on that with you. What do you think about this issue of drifting apart? President Trump did withdraw a number of troops, US troops from Germany. I certainly had a sense in Europe when I was there for a while this past summer of, my God, we're on our own now. I heard a very senior French diplomat talk about the need for containment vis-a-vis the United States. Certainly if President Trump was reelected, containment, of course, being a word coined here in the United States for how to approach the communist Soviet Union. I also had a sense in Europe that from a president for whom a day didn't go by without an untruth or a lie, outright lie, issuing from his lips. a feeling that the word of the United States, and of course the alliance in the end is based on trust, was not worth a whole lot. And possibly if Putin did choose to do something in the Baltic states, who knew if Article 5 would actually apply? So I guess it's not my role as a moderator to say this, but I'll say it. I guess I differ some with Jack on his assessment of that, and I'm interested in what your view is.
I think while we had President Trump in office, this feeling of drifting apart was very much there. But then after the elections that just took place, it is a sigh of relief that all Europeans are having at this moment, where I think we have to be cautious in thinking that everything is going back to normal. And I think we all agree on this panel that it will not be back to the future. Even if Jack was saying that, I still think it will not go exactly that way. Because coming back to the question we were asking about China, my impression is that we have a major problem there, a major issue between the United States and the Europeans, is what is the goal we want to pursue with China? Celia is very right in setting up the kind of reasonable balance agenda for a new relationship with China. But is it really what, it was certainly not what Trump was looking for, but is it really what the new US administration will be looking for? In other words, where we can still detect that because of the highly competitive confrontation between the US and China, for the American side, it may be all about keeping China down. Whereas for the Europeans, I see it in a different way. It is more about how to bring back China to being a reasonable partner, one that will abide by a rule-based order, one that will be ready to join our efforts to revisit the multilateral order, WTO, WHO, and other agencies, and try to get a multilateral order that will be back on course according to the principles and the values of a few years ago. Do we see this eye to eye between the Europeans and the Americans? I'm not entirely sure. And secondly, and I think this is also another challenge for both America and Europe, is that I'm not sure that our Asian partner are seeing it exactly the same way. You know, this whole idea that now we're facing more and more this confrontation between the West and the rest is still very much there. And with the virus that has just happened, the way the Western allies have shown their difficulty in managing the virus, contrary to what we have seen in most of the Asian countries, the way we're witnessing just recently, a few days ago, how the South Asian countries, China, Japan, Australia, have agreed to go ahead with a free trade agreement, which will be a major challenge for the United States and the Europeans, seems to indicate that what we're facing now altogether, the United States and the Europeans, is how to face that challenge, how to take into account what the Asian countries are telling us, that we need to reshape the multilateral order, to take into account their own interest, the composition of the UN Security Council, for instance, the board of the IMF. But then going much further, how do we get a more balanced world trade system? How do we take into account their own interests? I think this is really what it's all about. And do we see eye to eye with the Americans on how to do this? I'm not entirely sure. I'm not sure that the European conception of what a revisited multilateral order should be is exactly the same as the American side. And it's natural. We don't have exactly the same interests. So I think this is where the challenge lies for the transatlantic partnership.
Thank you, Pierre. Very interesting points. Sheri, Pierre just mentioned the virus. COVID has thrown up a whole lot of barriers, walls. An American passport in Europe these days is not worth a whole lot. It's very hard for a European even to visit the United States these days. I mean, this could begin to possibly to ease next year, but for now it's there. What do you see as the impact of COVID on the subjects we're talking about? It's the first major crisis, I think, since 1945, where international crisis, where the United States has been completely AWOL. Correct me if I'm wrong about that, but that's certainly my impression. And in that sense seems to mark a moment. You know, here was an immense global crisis. The United States did not lead in any way. The UN Security Council wasn't really capable of agreeing on anything. What is it telling us about the state of the world, and particularly US-European relations?
So, I mean, I think that that's a really good point to highlight, right? Because it highlights what a crisis looks like without a hegemon. It highlights what a crisis looks like without the United States. That is to say that it's not clear that even the most directed, efficient American administration could have solved this crisis, whatever that would mean. But you could imagine very easily a crisis that would have been dealt with more effectively had you had a strong power with the resources and the determination to coordinate efforts across borders, and to create a sense that countries were in this together. So first of all, I think this should give those folks who are worried about a post-hegemonic world a real data point to think about, because this is what crises will look like in the future if we don't have a United States there to help coordinate whatever, the responses of liberal democracies. I will say more generally, though, that the battle for the narrative on this crisis is really very much still in play. I mean, the Chinese, whose initial response to this crisis clearly made everything much, much worse, have been trying very hard since that initial phase to spin their ability to crush the virus in various parts of China as a vindication for its particular system of government. And insofar as the United States has been woefully unable to develop a better counter narrative around its own response, because its own response has been scattershot, inefficient, and frankly criminal. Then the Europeans also have done quite differently in how they've responded. It's very hard, again, to kind of see what the final or the ultimate impact politically of this crisis will be, not just on the sort of global battle between China and the West, but also on this question of how seriously we take global challenges in the future. I mean, I read every day articles in every newspaper about, the pandemic has pointed out how we need, again, coordination to solve things like, climate change, public health concerns, and terrorism. But thus far, I've seen no really good plans other than what I call the hortatory passive for, carrying those out, which is we must, without any concrete, realistic plans for how that's going to come about. And for those who don't like the United States as a global hegemon, I think the burden is on you to figure out what that is going to be. I'm not suggesting that can't happen, but I think we've seen what happens without that global hegemon. And the idea that simply having experienced this crisis will make the rest of the world better able to respond to the next one, I don't see having a lot of historical evidence behind it.
Yeah, I would say that if, as most of us assume, China and the United States are going to be the great powers of the 21st century, then COVID has been very much a cautionary tale, illustrating initially how a one-party authoritarian state is incapable of responding to crisis because of rampant fear and the instant marginalization or even elimination of those who were telling the truth. and then how a completely fractured United States, in which we have 72 million people voting for President Trump and 80 million for Joe Biden, but generally everybody just inhabiting their own ideological canyons, and a leader unable to focus on anything for any length of time, resulted in the compounding of that initial disaster in Wuhan. I'm going to ask one more question, I think, of Célia, and then turn this open to any questions. And just quickly, Célia, on Europe, I see a couple of things. One is that Brexit and President Trump's attitudes toward Europe have been galvanizing. You've seen Germany move away from austerity, ready to federalize some debt, the reactivation of the Franco-German engine in Europe. And at the same time, you see what Jack was just talking about. You have Hungary, you have Poland with varying degrees of illiberal models and going their own way. So what is the dominant story for you in Europe? Is it of galvanization and rebirth, or is it of a form of European fracture? And please keep that reasonably brief, because as I said, I'm going to open it up now.
Well, I was thinking earlier at the shared experience between the US and the EU, and one of them is what you point out to is that the same type of challenges you've experienced under the Trump administration has been experienced in Europe as well. The resurgence of nationalism, the strong populism, the demise of the left that I know Sheri has written a lot about, the sort of also awakening of progressive causes at the same time, and the ability to move very quickly on positions that were thought to be impossible to move, and that we've seen in the case of Germany that you're citing, a possibility to move rapidly under the fire of a crisis. I think the place we are now in Europe is the fact that after these years of crisis, there has been a clarification of who wants what at what cost. The Brexit is a reality, and Brexit has happened and has been now accepted by all, even though its material consequences is still uncertain at this point. The rest of Europe is ready and slightly more efficient, but it's Europe, so it's always slightly better every time. It's never a whole great better. It's just, a little bit better every time. And we're seeing it right now with the coordination around the second wave of COVID, where, Europe was hit at least as strongly as the US, even though for Europe it's only the second wave, and we're facing the third wave here in the US. But at least the coordination this time around on the European level was much better. And with much frontier coordination, but also the fact of having Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron talking about restrictions on the same day on their populations, etc. So we've seen, and we're hopefully facing the sort of decrease of the second wave within 1 week or two. So as always, Europe is always able to just walk a little bit further. We've seen it on the European defense, most recently on federalized budget. But it's never perfect. So it's very easy to criticize. It's always has, it's two steps forward and one step backward every time. I would argue that Europe is in a stronger position now than it was 5 years ago, though.
Okay, so I'm going to turn to questions from our audience. The first one here I see is from Mudit Jain, who is asking, and Jack, maybe you would take this one on. My question is not whether or not Europe and the United States are drifting apart, but whether the United States and Europe are united in their view of the world. What do you think about that, Jack?
Yeah, I think that it's a really interesting question. What is the basis for reunification of the United States and Europe culturally, ideologically, and as a political theme. So as we know, Joe Biden is proposing to call a conference of democracies sometime early in his term as president. How seriously should that be taken? And what would be the consequences of that within the West and between the unified West and its rival China? So the EU includes states that are drifting away from liberal democracy, Hungary and Poland. NATO includes states that have drifted away from liberal democracy, like Turkey. India, the world's largest democracy, is looking pretty shaky on the liberal part of liberal democracy. So is it going to be an effective and smart and well resonating appeal to say, we want to draw the lines of our club a little bit differently than we have had in the past with the EU, NATO, and our big tent of everyone's a democracy, no matter how shabby their democracy is? Do we want to draw the lines a little tighter around the countries that really are full, mature, stable, liberal democracies, if assuming that there are any of us left? And so would that create more of an alliance with a basis of a kind of a unified worldview and sense of values that could be a compact, effective actor in, for example, the political rivalry with China, the economic, the technological rivalry with China? Or would that be mostly in the negative column because it would mean pushing India away if India doesn't liberalize, pushing Hungary away if it doesn't liberalize, and just driving those countries into some other camp, meanwhile alienating China, who's going to have its backup every time the words human rights are mentioned? I'm not entirely sure where I come down on this issue, and I think a lot of it has to do with how this democracy message is implemented and articulated.
Thank you, Jack. Pierre, on that question, you suggested in your earlier remarks that the US and Europe are not united in their view of the world. Maybe a question of degree, or it may be something more radical than that. I wonder, could you just return to that for a moment on this question? And do Europe and the United States now actually look at the world very differently? Europe is part of this Eurasian landmass. Asia is rising. What Asia does, in some regards at least, clearly impacts this landmass more directly than a continent separated by oceans. What's your answer?
I think we don't see exactly the same in the same way when we look at the world today. And once again, if only because of what you were saying about our geographical position, our history, it is natural that we may have different views. Where the miracle of the transatlantic partnership has happened time and again is that usually we have managed to find some sort of common ground and to move together. But it was maybe easier after the Second World War and in the 60s and the 70s, because it was mostly a matter of pushing back against the Soviet Union, and it was the Cold War. nowadays in this multipolar world, with this this slow emergence of not only China, but most of the Asian world, the whole question is whether we can have exactly the same view and the same perspective of how to deal with that. Just to give you one illustration, which struck me in recent days, when I was discussing with some friends from Asia and telling them that I was quite impressed by this resilience of American democracy, as we have seen during these last elections, the answer on the part of my Asian interlocutors were, are you so sure? This looks very much like a highly fractured and fragmented American society. And the same is true about Europe. When we look at Poland, Hungary, corruption in some of our Eastern and Central European countries, are you sure that your democratic model is still moving in the right direction? And I detect that if we want to work with our American partners in trying to push forward, as I was saying earlier on, a new world order, we have to be very careful that we won't shape it along the lines of what we were dealing with in the last 40 or 50 years. We have to take on board some new ideas that come from the other side, from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America. And this is where I think there may be different points of view on both sides of the Atlantic, because America being what it is, as Sheri was rightly undermining, still the most powerful political player, the potential hegemon, if it wants to go back to this, therefore with a strong, quite often unilateral view of the world. This is not exactly where Europe stands. Europe is much more able to be self-deprecating. Célia just reminded us a few minutes ago that we go from crisis to crisis and moving very painfully ahead. The European integration is a cumbersome process. We're 27, it takes time, it's difficult. And so I think we have a different view, one that is more humble to some extent and more modest nowadays. We have suffered a lot. You know, the former colonial powers, like Britain and France, have learned their lessons now. And we still need to do more. I agree on that, but we have learned a little bit about this. Do we see it exactly in the same way, how to reshape and revisit multilateralism, the balance between the different continents? I'm not so sure.
Yes, Jean Monnet, I think, said that Europe makes itself in crises. So it will be interesting to see what finally emerges from the current crisis. Here's another question that perhaps you would take, Sheri, and it's this. Could the lame duck Trump administration withdraw the United States from NATO, the WTO, and or the United Nations before its term ends? And if it tries to do this, could it be countered?
So that's a sort of frightening question along the lines of what happens if Trump, has to be carried out of the White House on, January 20th or something. I mean, no, I don't think that's possible because, you would need to bring at the very least part of the Republican Party along with you, and I'm not fully sure that they're that far gone yet. So I don't put anything past.
Isn't it the Trump party at this point?
Well, I don't put anything past Trump. He's obviously a petulant, sore loser, but whether he could actually do that, that's not an executive order on, December 11th kind of thing. So, I mean, that is not to poo-poo the threat represented by Trump. It is not to poo-poo the damage that he can do in the 11 weeks or whatever it is between the election and the inauguration of a new president. I'm not so worried about those kinds of moves, or at least not yet. But I would like to just throw out two other points, if I may, although I don't want to take time away from the other questions. One is, I think that we haven't really grappled with this question of whether the transatlantic relationship can be held together as much by even the potential of positive goals as opposed to negative goals. I mean, let's be honest that the American commitment to Europe and the transatlantic relationship was built largely, not entirely, but largely on, a shared fear of the immediate, obvious, and consistent threat of the Soviet Union. That was a very effective glue. And so while we obviously have shared values again, and there'll be more under Biden than Trump, I think that's something that needs more thinking. And then the other question is this question of sort of democracy and club of democracy that all of my colleagues here have brought up. I mean, look, as a Europeanist, it is simply tragic. I mentioned watching Hong Kong protesters with the American flag. It is simply tragic to recognize that Europe, the European Union, has been unable to stop very, very significant backsliding within its own club. I mean, European integration was built on the idea of defending liberal democracy. And we now have Hungary, which is not a democracy anymore. It's not a liberal democracy, it's just not a democracy. And Poland, which is sliding in that direction. So, we talk about how much the Trump administration turned its back on democracy, but let's be honest, Europe has proven unable to stop democratic backsliding within its own borders. And in fact, even quote unquote avatars or champions of liberal democracy like Angela Merkel sat back while People's Party representatives in the European Parliament essentially allowed Orban to run roughshod over democracy in Hungary. So there is a lot that needs to be done on both sides of the Atlantic to rebuild something that practically, realistically corresponds to those quote unquote values that we share. And I think there's a lot of conversation and discussion that needs to happen about turning those values into reality on both sides of the Atlantic as well.
It's very good points, Sheri. I mean, I would just say that as well as the Soviet tanks poised on the Prussian plain, which did focus the mind and bring the United States and Europe together, there was also the Marshall Plan and the realization that prosperity and stability in Europe was also, by extension, greater prosperity for the United States. And I feel that that's what President Trump reduced all this to a zero-sum game, where one side was a winner, one a loser. I think probably we'd all agree that both Europe and the United States have benefited enormously economically from the alliance. Sheri, you were speaking about Poland, and here's a question from somebody in Poland, and it goes as follows. And Celia, perhaps you'd take this. I am from Poland, and in our national news, they say that Trump won the election. So the drifting apart is not far away. How can we get back together with the US when we're not even close to getting back together as a European Union? So the Polish news is saying Trump won. They like Trump a lot.
Well, it also underlines what Jack was talking about earlier, which is the drifting apart within societies. What I'm struck about on this front, and first, to be fair to this person, there was a confusion on the first day as people didn't know what was the final results until a few days later when Joe Biden was called the winner. And so I wonder if this Polish TV declared him the winner on the first day, maybe due to the red mirage, I don't know. What is very striking to me is that what we see at the moment is a shared experience on both sides of the Atlantic, on not only with regard to COVID, but with regard to the evolution of our societies. It's the disruptive influence of technologies. It's about the hollowing of the middle class. It's about rising inequalities. It's about, once again, populism, nationalism, but also as we see the rise of conspiracy theories and its influence on everyday life. And at the same time that you have all these phenomena that makes our two societies having a sort of a shared experience, the remedy to these challenges seems to be highly national or at least divergent on two sides of the Atlantic. So in the US, on the right, you've seen calls for more protectionism, but the new Democratic administration might jump in as well and offer its own protectionist remedies. Joe Biden talks about Buy American and strengthening the industrial regions of America. So the way to protect, to remedy these experiences in the US is about more protectionism and in a way more isolationism from what's going on in the rest of the world. In Europe, you hear Macron talk about sovereign Europe, and you hear about strategic autonomy and the need for Europeans to decide for themselves and in a way to isolate themselves also from these difficulties. So the paradox is that we might be at a moment where shared experiences are at its maximum because we're in a globalized world of information and we live through the same experiences up to the point of COVID, a shared pandemic in many ways, but the solutions or the remedies that are offered both on the right and on the left are heavily nationalized, and there's very hardly a common ground. So I wonder about that, what this is going to produce, that we all live through the same elements, and yet the only way out of it is to shield ourselves and protect ourselves, which is an entirely different answer from what we experienced in the 80s, in the 90s, with globalization, openness of markets, which might have provoked these shared difficulties right now. But we're going in these different bunkers, and I don't know what is the middle ground anymore.
That's pretty depressing, Celia.
I didn't do it on purpose.
In a way, you addressed this question from Simon Doucet in Paris, who asked, do the US and Europe face the same democratic issues? You seem to say yes. Should they cooperate to strengthen rules and values? Your answer seemed to be, I hope so, but I don't really see any of that happening. If anything, they're going in a different direction toward nationalism.
They should cooperate, but they seem to be protecting each other from each other. There's a lot of that at the moment.
What's your take on that, Jack? I mean, this Simon is asking, should they cooperate to strengthen rules and values? Celia thinks, and probably we all think we should, but that the pressures arising out of waves of immigration, insecurity, hollowing out of the middle class, as Celia said, disruptive effect of technology, and now of COVID. People are anxious, people are fearful, and when they're anxious and fearful, they tend to turn toward glib nationalist solutions of the America First variety.
So not all of the problems and not all of the solutions are at the international level requiring international cooperation. A lot of the problems and a lot of the solutions could very well be at the national level. So let's take COVID. I think the biggest problems for the US and Europe have been internal to the country. It's mostly been the problem that people are not behaving responsibly. They're sick and tired of doing the right thing, the lockdowns, and they're misbehaving, and things are spiking uncontrollably as a result. Granted, with the Europeans, on average, especially Germany, managing this better than the US. But these were common national problems that couldn't be solved by international cooperation. the biggest solution, successful solution that we've seen for COVID has been the stupendously fast and apparently incredibly successful development of a couple of vaccines that are above 90% in efficacy. This is the result of, modern science and capitalist incentives. But to give credit where credit is due, the likely rapid rollout of mass inoculations is made possible by the fact that the US federal government bankrolled the pre-purchasing of mass doses of the vaccines, even not knowing which ones were going to pan out. And that was a national response that in the hands of Joe Biden undoubtedly will have beneficial spillover for the rest of the world. Likewise on the protectionism as a problem, and the nationalization of the solutions to economic pain. Some of the solutions to economic pain might be green energy investments, which could be at the national level or the international level. And for the US, the refurbishment of infrastructure, a huge investment that'll be mostly at the national level, one would assume.
Thank you very much. Pierre, we're running out of time, unfortunately. Pierre, I would have to ask you to answer this question fairly briefly. And the question is this, it's on China, US, and European strategic autonomy. It's a two-part question. What happens with the EU-US working relationship if China means what it says and starts to incorporate Taiwan by force or starts hostilities in the seas around China, and the US then effectively enters war with China? It's question one, nice and simple. Question two is, what will Europe actively do to prevent the economic and technological further rise of China, an increasingly assertive China, in order to lessen the chance of scenario one? In 1 minute, please.
I'm not entirely sure that the second part of the question is necessarily linked to the first one. The first one, with regard to Taiwan, seems to me to be one that is very sensitive, no doubt about it, and where all sides have to move in very cautiously. This is definitely the red line for China, no doubt about it, and we all know that. And therefore, at least from a diplomatic point of view, we need to tread very cautiously when we deal with China. That was certainly one of the issues where the Trump administration has made some very bold moves that fortunately didn't lead to confrontation. But in the few weeks remaining before the January the 20th, we have to watch this very carefully. In my opinion, there is really, what can be done is to try to keep the status quo for the time being, as smoothly as possible from all sides. Because once again, this is an issue where China will not budge, it will not move, and will not accept in any way that we go back on the one nation principle that has been set up everywhere. Now, of course, we have Hong Kong, we know that, and Sheri and others alluded to that quite rightly so, and I think there we need to be very firm. But Hong Kong is a different issue compared to Taiwan. Taiwan is once again a much more sensitive one, and we have to be careful. On the second issue, Europe at the moment is lagging behind in terms of technology and capacity to live up to the level of Chinese high-tech and supremacy here and there. At the moment, Europe is trying to come back in the field with all these ideas of new technology, a jump for the Europeans. I think one of the difficulties we're facing there is a matter of time. We're lagging behind, and we have lost a lot of our technological edge in the last few years. So it's about jumping now back into some of the more state-of-art technology, artificial intelligence and other fields where we need to be more competitive. Money is being poured into this. The European Commission has many plans for this, and therefore I think we need to go ahead and be able to be competitive in the years ahead there.
Thank you very much, Pierre. We are out of time. I want to echo the words that I see here of Gunther Seidel, who sent in a comment, not a question, and his comment was, thank you for the highly interesting contributions of the panelists. I concur with that entirely. Thank you all very much for a very enlightening conversation. And I will now turn things over to François to bring this event to a conclusion.
Thank you, Roger. Thanks to our panelists. I would also like to echo these thanks and stress the very stimulating and thought-provoking character of this discussion. We would like also to thank our co-sponsors, and there are several of them, the Columbia Alumni Association, the Columbia Maison Française, Columbia University Libraries, the Institute for Ideas and Imagination, the Europe Legal Studies Center at the Law School, la revue Le Grand Continent, la Maison de l'Europe à Paris, Sciences Po American Foundation, and also this event was made possible thanks to the support of the Erasmus program of the European Union and of the advisory board of the Columbia Global Center in Paris. Our next event will be on climate change. The topic will be, can the EU lead the fight against climate change? It will be on December 15, and our speakers will be Laurence Toubiana, Enrico Letta, Adam Tooze, Jason Bordoff, and Alex Halliday from Columbia. So we hope to see you there again in December. Many thanks.